Perfect.
I seem to have figured it out because of your excellent instructions.
Oh, perfect. Dore, welcome. It's so lovely to see you.
Thank you, Artem. It's so wonderful to be here, and I'm so honored to be part of this conference and to really support what you are doing and what you have initiated. It really feels to me like an extraordinary thing to be supporting this. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So as the process, would you like to share your case first and then I hop back online, or would you like me to stay? Which would you prefer?
No, Artem, please do stay. I'd very much like you to stay. And I'll say that really the reason that I'm asking you to stay is fundamental to the way that I relate to storytelling. And that is that I see storytelling always as part of a dynamic, which is in reciprocity with listening. So there's a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. You know, listening is like a bowl and telling is like liquid that's poured into the bowl. So just as the bowl gives the liquid its shape, so listening gives storytelling its shape. So your listening is crucial to my speaking. Otherwise, I'm kind of gazing into my camera here. I hope my gaze is correct. Does it look like I'm looking directly into the screen?
Yes.
Look at that little green light. But at least at the same time, you're there. And I know that there's somebody right now who's listening to me, which is going to shape my speaking. And so also listening is such a tremendous gift that we receive, because without the gift of listening, our stories really have no place to go, right? They have no place to land. So, so thanks for being my dedicated listener. You know, Artem, I was thinking that in terms of this topic, you know, can storytelling change the world? I would like to set up this question really by telling my own story of how I got into doing the work that I do, because I think it will reflect both how I see storytelling and how I define storytelling, and also it's a good example for reflection on this question: can storytelling change the world? So really, my entree into storytelling begins long ago when I was a clinical psychologist in South Africa. And I was listening to the stories of patients. And the idea then was to, the story is something that you're using as a therapeutic, intervention in a way. You're listening to stories with the hope that by telling their story to you, the patient will see their own life more clearly. Anyhow, didn't want to be a psychologist anymore, so I came to New York City, to reinvent myself and to become a playwright, and to think about telling stories in the more artistic mode. Anyway, after 3 years of that, I realized just how difficult it is to be a playwright in New York City, and I went back to university again, this time to get a PhD in social work and anthropology combined, because I was much more interested and am much more interested in group practice than individual practice. So I had to do a kind of a field work as a part of this PhD. And I was asked by the people at Columbia University, what would you like to do? And I said, absolutely anything, but please, nothing to do with HIV or AIDS. I'm a gay man. I've just arrived in New York City. The epidemic is still raging. There have been no medications yet for people with HIV or AIDS. And I don't need this in my personal life and in my work life as well. Well, as they say, if you're a religious person, God gives you what you need, not what you want. And so I end up, or the universe gives you what you need, not what you want. And so I end up working with AIDS patients. And my job is to help them come to terms with the fact that they are dying, right? And what do? I mean, trained as a psychologist, I was very much used to asking people how they felt and try to interpret people's experiences and feelings, but this was irrelevant to my clients in the program. They were dying, and they said, well, what do I care what I'm feeling? How would you feel if you knew you were going to die? And this was true. I mean, in any week in our program, people would come, it was called a day program, so people would come and spend their days there. In any week, there'd be a gathering of clients in the middle of the day, only to be told that somebody had died. One of the clients had died in hospital, and everybody gathered together in the kind of common room where all the clients gathered, and they would exchange some quick memories about the person who died, and then they'd go on with their day. And then what would happen is some days later, the person's belongings would end up in a garbage bag. And nobody came to claim those garbage bags. So one realized that people were dying, leaving nothing of themselves really behind. Their last belongings were now in these garbage bags. No one came to claim them. And if you were alive, you saw, this is what's going to happen to me when I die. I'll also be completely forgotten. I'll also become irrelevant. So what can you do in a situation like that? And I drew on what I'd learned as a playwright, that we all have a story to tell. And the one legacy we can all leave behind is our story. And all you need for your story to be heard and remembered is others to be able to listen to it. So for my clients who were dying, they knew that as long as I was listening to their story and as long as I was still alive, their story would be received. It would be heard. It would be inscribed into the human legacy. So that's what I did. I said, I'm going to listen to clients' stories, and a lot of them yelled at me and said to me, I don't have a story. I'm a crack addict. You know, I've been rejected by my family. I'm gay, whatever the case may be. And I said, no, you do have a story. Your story is what happened to you, right? That's ultimately what your story is. What happened to you? And so that's the basis of my storytelling method, is for people simply to say what happened to them. No interpretations, no judgments, no commentaries, nothing intellectual. It's simply a sensory account of what happened to you. So people started to come in to tell their stories in my group. They shared stories about their experiences with drugs, with sex work, some of them. And by Christmas of 1994, remember there were no medications yet for people with HIV, so this was a death sentence. By Christmas of 1994, my storytelling group was filled with people wanting to share their stories. They got it, that this is the one thing that we can leave behind. And one woman said to me, would you make a videotape of my story? I have a very young daughter. She'll never get to know me because I will have died. And so would you make a video of my story that I can leave for her as a legacy? And then all my clients wanted videos. Then what happened was in 1995, early 95, when New York State, which is the state that I'm in, were threatening cutbacks to people with HIV and AIDS, my clients went to the state capitol in Albany, and they left their videotapes on the desks of the legislators. And they said, listen to my story and then tell me I don't deserve services. And these clients were not alone. There were people with AIDS from organizations across New York State, and they all descended upon the legislators' offices. That is how the AIDS epidemic changed worldwide. It was the stories that did it. It was the connection of the heart to the mind. And it was not the statistics, right? It was not the sort of ideological sort of arguing and frustrated. As important as that stuff is, we've got to have the numbers. But when we hear the stories give substance to the numbers. So this, Artem, is where I really heard and learned for myself firsthand the tremendous power of storytelling, not only to bring people a sense of healing and connection with one another around certain issues such as AIDS, but also that these were things that could be used in the realm of advocacy, that people could advocate for themselves using their stories as a medium. And I've been working in that same way ever since then. So for the past 30 years, I've been working with groups of people, helping them to tell their stories as a way of affecting change. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I bet you, given the topic of your conference, Stories Without Borders, there are so many people who are in our realm, in our milieu, who are working in the area of storytelling, who've probably had the same experience that I had of, when you're working with people in a room, in a space, in a community, and you viscerally feel that that kind of the transformational quality of storytelling, we can then get to the feeling, wow, if only people could get this, if only people could understand this, we could change the whole world like this, So that's really my question. So Artem, thank you so much for your beautiful listening, because remember that without your listening, I would have no story to tell. I'm wondering what your reflections are on the story that I've just told, and from your experience, of course, what you think, what your answer is to that question. And then, of course, I would love people to, put into the chat, what their views are about, can storytelling change the world? What experiences have people had that are transformational? Anyway, over to you, Artem.
Oh, that was a beautiful story, Murray. And I know I've heard parts when you were telling it, but wow, every time it's just too deep to my heart. What my key thought is, maybe after your story, is that it depends how we define change, and it depends how we define world, because those people eventually will go to the next life. It will never change. That's the order of event. But to say that storytelling didn't change something, that would be an understatement. To say that everywhere AIDS is treated better after these stories is not true. But to say that nothing has changed is an understatement. So I don't really have an answer, but I really feel that there is an urge to find one after you're hearing your story. That's my thought. And our participants say, of course it can. It already does. And Denise is also joining us with a comment on your story, which is beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you, Artem. Well, yeah, I like what you're saying. It's like, well, how do you define change, right? How do you define world? How do you define even story and listening, So I'll give another example of work that I'm doing at the moment. And again, I would love to hear your reflections. So I'm doing the largest project that I've ever done, I'm doing at the moment, and that has to do with addressing the issue of violence against women and other vulnerable minorities in El Salvador. Now, El Salvador has a 500-year history of violence, beginning with the Spanish conquest of that country. And really, the country has been plundered by violence ever since then, and tremendous oppression of Native individuals in that country. So the United States Department of State, i.e. the US government, have sponsored this project, asking me if I could apply my storytelling method, the same method that I developed for the people with AIDS in the AIDS program in 1994. Could I apply that method throughout an entire country, in other words, the country of El Salvador, to bring an end to this violence that is just pervasive, violence against women, pervasive. There's there's a word which is commonly used in Latin America. The word is femicide, which is a specific word that applies to the murder of women, right? So I've had the good fortune of spending 2 years there now, going to El Salvador and working with groups, local groups, teaching people how to listen and share stories according to my what happened method. In other words, it's fact-based storytelling. And the way that I've kind of rationalized this or theorized about it is that there is an epidemic of silence which underpins the epidemic of violence. The way that violence can continue and why violence continues is when people don't speak about it and when they and therefore don't take any action against it, right? So just think of what it would take for that to change in an entire country. It would mean that women and these other vulnerable groups and men and even the perpetrators themselves would have to speak up, about the violence. What does that take? What does that take? And when I'm working with small groups of people in communities throughout El Salvador, and I see how liberating it is for people to speak about those violent things that have happened to them that they've never spoken about before, it's so liberating. And you can just imagine, wow, what would it be only like if everyone in the country could do this, right? You see the possibility of it. And I'm sure that other people who are on this call right now have had that same feeling. It's like where you're working with people. And of course, storytelling ignites that very fire that is the symbol of this conference, right? It ignites that. And then at the same time, there's a huge, massive incarceration of men in El Salvador, which is that government's way of dealing with a violent problem. You don't talk about it, you just throw people into prison and, you deal with the problem that way. And when I hear about that, I can find myself easily deflated about the work that I'm doing. So when I'm working with people in the field, groups of people listening and so grateful to share their stories with one another, it gives one a great sense of optimism and hope. And then, of course, you read the news and that can easily be dashed, so that kind of hope and that kind of optimism. So, again, like you say, change is very relative, how we see change. But anyway, once again, I would love to hear any reflections from the others who are listening in right now, and also your reflections, Artem.
I think after hearing your story, I'm starting to grasp something that actually was present in this conference before. In your first story, you didn't change the world. You gave people a permission to be more present, to be more dignified, to share their story, and that in turn changed their world. In this story with El Salvador, you're not changing the world again per se, but you're eliminating the silence by helping people speak up. And when the silence goes away, the world is slowly changing. So what I hear in both of these stories is that storytelling is not the end process of changing the world. It's just like a hammer to building a house. It's just a tool for doing something. You wouldn't live in a brick or in a hammer, but together they can change something else. So those are my thoughts.
It's beautiful, Artem, because again, using your metaphor here of fire. So in a sense, storytelling is the fire. It's the thing that can actually ignite these other elements that already are existing, And I think that although we don't want to think of wildfires, I come from South Africa and we have these awful wildfires there. Actually, we have these awful wildfires here in the States, which are mass, they're destroying masses of things. We don't want storytelling to be that kind of wildfire. but it's the kind of fire which, can ignite other candles, one could say. When one person tells their story and breaks the silence, they're really giving others permission to do the same thing. So, I like also what you say about storytelling as a vehicle in a way, not an end in itself.
Thank you, Murray. I have a question, and I'm going to bounce off what Denis is writing. He's asking, how do you manage potential frustration when you do not see the change as you expected? And I would actually add to it, not only the frustration of like yourself as a story practitioner, but also the frustrations of those who have enough guts to tell a story and are anticipating something to change.
That's a great question, actually. I think that for me, I am, and I'm sure that other people in this conference are like myself, storytelling evangelists, right? We believe in the power of storytelling. We will not be dissuaded from that. Nothing will dissuade me from my belief in the power of storytelling. But what happens with that frustration? So for me, frustration, if you are able to breathe through it, right? And face it, you face it, you try to understand what's underneath the frustration, what's leading to it, and those obstacles that are getting in the way, then you can actually learn a lot from that. It helps you to learn from and analyze that situation when you truly understand what people's frustrations are. So I think that when people are frustrated, whereas our temptation is to become frustrated and disheartened, if you can find a way to actually walk into the frustration and face it and try to understand what's behind it, I think that's always the optimal situation. We learn so much from things that don't work, just as we learn from things that do work. Just as long as we're taking that analytical perspective and reflecting on what we do.
Agreed. Again, great reflection there. I actually want to ask you to share a bit more on the work you're doing to stop this epidemic of silence. Maybe I don't know. Maybe an account of what happened to you and to the participants, or a procedure. What you are comfortable of sharing at this point of the project.
I'm happy to share at the moment. In fact, we have just right now, like as of this moment, published a guide, a storytelling guide, which will go out to young leadership organizations and social change organizations, psychologists, social workers, and educationalists throughout El Salvador, teaching them how to work with people at all levels in group situations on how to listen and share stories with one another. So our good fortune is that we've been able to work with a grassroots organization in El Salvador that has connections throughout the country, schools, communities, churches, other kinds of organizations. And so we have people within all of these organizations who I've trained to go out and apply these methods, right, in the communities. One of the primary ways we're doing this is we're working with girls' clubs in El Salvador. Now, girls' clubs are a little bit like the Scouts. Do you have the Scouts in Russia?
We understand the concept, I guess, but I'm not sure if we have that.
Okay, so these are girls' clubs. These are places that the girls go after school, and they receive the kind of education that they're not receiving at school. Education about, the development of their bodies, for instance, and the different ways in which girls can become empowered, because girls and women in El Salvador, obviously because of the amount of violence against them, are a tremendously oppressed group of people, often who don't have a voice, don't have any way of expressing themselves. So by working with these girls' clubs and teaching them how to tell stories about themselves and their experiences. We're starting at a young age to help people to change themselves and their own circumstances. So I started off by working with a group of 8 mentors. So these are people that go throughout the country and work with these girls in the girls' clubs, running the different curriculums. So the way that I always work is that whoever I'm training has to be able to tell their own story as well. Whoever I'm training. So that's always the basis. I'm not going to ask anybody else to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. So if you want to be a leader in my method, you must be willing to share your own story. Anyway, because of the epidemic of silence around violence in El Salvador, I reckoned, well, you can't just go in and ask people to tell stories about violence if they've already been silenced about it, right? You're just going to be met with more silence. So what can you ask people to talk about that will get you to the experiences that women have without hitting them over the head, so to speak, with questions about violence? And this is where I joined this project with another project that I'm founded and directed, which is the World Mother Storytelling Project, which is to teach people all around the globe how to listen to and retell the stories of their mothers. Now, this worked absolutely perfectly in El Salvador because, it's a Catholic country. People are very, admiring of their mothers. They venerate their mothers. And so to ask people to tell stories about their mothers is a way to break the silence. So I have one woman, one of these mentors, who has had a terrible relationship with her mother, absolutely terrible. It turned out that her father was killed in the Civil War, while her mother was pregnant with her. And so when she was born, she she reminded her mother of this murdered husband. And so she kind of rejected this young woman. Anyway, finally, the mother emigrated to the States. She went to the United States, and this girl was raised by grandmother and other family members. So she comes into my workshop, where they're going to be telling stories about their mothers, and this is what comes up. This is the first time she has ever told this story to other people. In fact, one might even say it's the first time she's ever told the story to herself, right? What had happened with her mother? She has not talked to her mother for years. And she decides, as a result of this program that she was on with us, that she is going to contact her mother. So she contacts her mother, and the next day, it turns out that overnight, between the day that she told the story about her mother and really sort of, came out with it for the first time ever, that night she became ill with COVID. But the next day, she took the most enormous effort to safely return to our workshop with her mask on, because she wanted to share with the rest of the group what had happened in the conversation she had had with her mother the night before. And it turned out that she just told the mother, this is the story that I have about you. Her mother said, I completely understand that you would feel this way. And her mother tried to explain to her from her own perspective and tell her own story about why things had happened in the way that they had happened. She said to us, my mother has given permission for me to tell this story publicly. Please tell the story publicly so that others can learn from it. And this young woman said, I now have a new mother. I have a new relationship with my mother. Until that point, she had just been too terrified to tell that story. It was too shameful. The anger towards her mother, the effect of the violence during the Civil War, and all the impact that had on the family. she just had not been able to talk about that. There wasn't the receiving context, you know. One of my most beloved mentors, Michael White, who founded narrative therapy, you know, talked about these receiving contexts into which we can tell our story. So I'm working as much about building receiving contexts for stories as I am to help people tell the stories of what happened to them.
Oh, this was such a lovely account of an event. Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Artem.
wow.
I think it's very late and you've been listening all day, and I really appreciate just how much effort and attention it's taking for you to stay present with listening. That's incredible to receive.
I'm here with you. My eyes a bit itchy because of the blooming, but I felt as if I was present at this workshop you've led, where she was sharing with her mask on that this changed. I guess this story really means that story can change, can eliminate the silence, and therefore create new meaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Artem. Any other comments or chats? Please don't be shy to ask questions or you know, any kind of reflection that you have.
We have one great comment from Vinod, a very active participant. He's writing, frustration is such a lovely indicator of what we want while being a mirror to the story that's running in our mind.
Sorry, what was the first word there?
Frustration.
Frustration. Would you read that again, Artem?
Frustration is such a lovely indicator of what we want while being a mirror to the story that's running in our mind.
Oh, that's just incredible. Thank you for that reflection. And yes, that's the point, you know, that frustration gives us something to rub up against, right? And of course, we want to see a brilliant result. But, you know, when we're talking about something like a 500-year history of violence in a country, well, we're not going to deal with, you know, that's not going to be solved overnight. So yes, we must work with that frustration. We must be willing to. And I think that's also, Artem, why I jumped at the opportunity to come onto this conference with you, because how do we deal with that frustration? We also engage with our colleagues. You know, we have conversations like these. That's why your Stories Without Borders, you know, concept and what you've created here is such a great one, because, you know, so many of us are working in the world, you know, doing our best to make a difference. And so to have a community of people that we're sharing with is also one of the ways in which we overcome our own frustrations and are able to overcome that sort of burnout and go back into these situations.
Agreed exactly with that. Murray, we have one more question coming from the chat. Let me quote it to you. You made me curious, says Lori. Tell me about your dissertation work. How do you define the DNA of a story, its construct to bridge to your case study story work? And love your presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me just listen to that question again so I can understand it.
Of course. You made me curious. Tell me more about your dissertation work. I guess that's what you noticed earlier. How do you define the DNA of a story, its construct to bridge to your case study story work?
Okay, the DNA of a story. Okay, so for me, a story is an account of what happened, right? A story is not an opinion. A story is not a judgment, and a story is not a statement of feeling. For instance, I'm so frustrated by the situation in El Salvador because people are really victimized and they don't know what to do and they don't know where to turn. This is not a story, okay? This is an interpretation. It's a collection of feelings. It's a collection of sort of impressions about the world. That for me is not story. A story is a very journalistic, legalistic account in a way of this happened and then that happened and then that happened. So for me, a story depends, the stronger the emotional turning point in a story, the stronger the story is going to be. And this is, this is the typical poetics of Aristotle. So we start off, the hero or the individual starts off on a journey, wants to accomplish something, and they get to a point of frustration or a turning point. Something happens. It's a point of high emotion. And then how do they resolve that something that happens? How do they resolve that conflict? That's what makes a story. So your story has your beginning, it has your emotional turning point, and it has your end. That for me is the DNA of a story. Then, how do you tell the story? Through the details, right? Through the details, through the things that you could see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. That is a story for me. Anything else is not a story, right? So if I were to say to you, my patients in the AIDS day treatment program felt very frustrated by the fact that their families had rejected them. So this is feeling and this is interpretation. Their families had rejected them. Well, if someone says, at midnight, I went to the shelter and the people at the shelter said to me, look at all the people, there's not a bed to be had in this shelter. I'm sorry, you can't sleep here tonight. So I walked all the way to my mother's house through the rain, and I didn't even have an umbrella. And I got to my mother's house and I knocked on the door, and my mother opened the door and she said to me, there's no room for you in my life anymore. Get the hell out of here. Now that's a story, right? That's a story because it's show, not tell. So that's for me what the DNA of a story. It's really using sensory detail as a way of driving forward the character and driving forward the action and getting towards that resolution. Does that make sense? Do you think that answers Laurie's question?
Laurie says, thank you for the answer, so I guess it does.
Thank you for the question.
We have some more in the chat. Let me quote them to you. I suppose I know the answer to the next one, but still. Do you use folk tales in your work? For what and how exactly, if yes?
I do not use folk tales in my work, unless somebody in their story tells as part of the story a folk tale that was told to them. So in other words, if grandpa or grandma told you a folk tale, yes, that's part of your personal story. That's part of what happened to you, right? But my particular area of expertise and work is exclusively in personal storytelling, not folk tales. I have great respect for people who know folk tales. Of course, I come from South Africa. We have a huge history of folk tales in Africa, but it's not my area of expertise.
And you instantly answered the why question that Jana sent. I love how you give this twist to it, unless it's a part of the what happened to the person.
Yeah, and I love it, Artem, I love it when people, for instance, if someone's telling a story, and let's say they said their grandmother used to pray every night, then I say, tell us the prayer. What was the prayer? If your grandmother made a certain dish that she loved to, tell us what was the dish. How do you make it? Do you know how to make it? If your grandfather loved to sing a particular song, sing us the song. So yes, bring songs, bring folk tales, bring in recipes, anything that gives us a texture of of your story.
Couldn't agree more. I know that folk tales are powerful, but every time a true, honest story of this particular person comes in, it just changes everything. We have one more question, Murray, and I would love to follow up with this one because it's beautiful. How do you take care of yourself when you hear horror stories of abuse?
Well, that for me, and thank you for this question. Thank you. So who asks that question, Artem?
This is from Anna.
Anna, thank you so much for that question. Anna, I would say that for me, this is where this work enters into the spiritual domain. I am a meditator and I am a Buddhist practitioner. And so for me, being able to have the time and the space to contemplate what I've heard, to consider that it's really part of our human condition, that the suffering that I'm hearing is part of the human condition, and to realize that I need to take care of myself as a listener, which means that I have to constantly be monitoring my listening. If my listening has become too exhausted, for instance, if it's too tired, I have to say we need to stop now. I can't listen anymore. And it's very respectful to the person who's telling their story to say, I want to be able to give you my full attention, and I can't right now. It's just too much for me. So I think that on the one hand, it's kind of working with myself through my meditation, through understanding maybe even how the stories that I'm hearing are connecting with my own experience and triggering things or hooking me in particular ways. I must be very vigilant to be able to watch out for that as well. And I'm also having, again, just like we're doing right now, having somebody that I can be sharing with, another person who I can reflect with and say, I don't know why, for instance, but I'm just feeling exhausted today. Well, what might have happened in the conversation or in the stories that's kind of really hooked you, touched you very deeply. But of course, this is always something that we're grappling with. And what I've often heard in my work throughout the world, because I'm always working with marginalized people, is that people can become very, very numb. In fact, a lot of Salvadorans have told me that the reason for the silence as well is that people have just become numb. They just don't feel anymore. And they're afraid to feel because they're afraid that if they start to feel, they're just going to become overwhelmed with feelings, right? So we have to create, and this is a very overused word, safe spaces for the storytelling. And I have very, very specific definition of what I mean by safe space. But this is another way of dealing with the emotions that arise in the group with the participants and my own emotions as well. I hope that answers the question, Anna.
For me, it does. And yet you're getting lots of fires and brilliant from Lurana. Great to learn about your thoughts and way of managing self from Vinod. And just pure appreciation from me for this conversation. Thank you so much. I have only one last question.
Yeah.
You've heard it before, so what is one meaning that you would like to inspire people about so they can change something and we live in the world with more connections in it?
I think that in this current, somebody was telling me about a new book, and I can send you the title. Artem. In fact, I won't look at my mobile phone right now, but somebody sent me a article, a literary review, which is also about a book that's just been written, which is about the overuse of stories. Like in the States, everything is a story. You pick up your cereal, to eat breakfast in the morning, and on the back of the cereal box it says our story. Everything's a story now. If your tubes of toothpaste have the founders of the company's story on it, everything's a story. So and also with Facebook and all the other social media, people are sharing their stories all the time. So I think we really have to think about, why do we want to share these kinds of personal stories, and why now? We must answer this question for ourselves. What's my burning passion? What do I want to address through storytelling, and why is this the moment? So you're separating this kind of storytelling that can make a difference, storytelling that is meaningful, from storytelling that's just kind of everyday storytelling that's being used to sell one product after the other. So that would be my sort of main advice, is kind of really know why you want to harness this human, our birthright to tell stories. Why do you want to do that, and why now? What's the urgency? The urgency to that question is what wakes us up to want to do our work.
Oh, this is beautiful. Why story and why now? I'm going to take this into the collection. I've had such a big pleasure listening to you, just as always. And please follow me in my example. I'm giving you the fire, and my appreciation flies to you, Murray, for joining this event and being a part of this bridge.
Thank you, Artem, and wishing you all the best in the future. You can always count on me for support, and I hope that your Stories Without Borders conference just grows from strength to strength.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And for me. Bye-bye now.
Oh, wow. That's been such a journey, eh? I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I really thank everyone who is listening right now or in the recordings for this pure account of story. I want to wrap this up by sharing a small story with you. I do not think that sharing a big story is something that a small man from a big country is a good thing right now. So just one last bridge. Several weeks ago, I came to the kitchen, and my father-in-law was making himself tea. He came up to the box with the tea packages, and out of one of the boxes, he picked up a tea package, and when he walked up to the pot, he held it up in his hand and he said, "Oh, look, G stands for greed, because I picked up 2 packages instead of 1. One got stuck to the other." In that moment, my lovely wife, Anne, who you saw tonight, telling her story, she, without skipping a bit, she says, "Well, G is for generosity if you choose to make somebody else the second cup of tea." And for a glimpse of a moment, I saw on this brutal man's face a smile that was full of freedom of choice. And I believe that every one of us can build even smallest bridges just by changing one word, not even a story. And this is exactly what I wish you all. I wish you all to continue building bridges, because you are already doing it every day of your life. And I wish you to build bridges for the people that are around you. Thank you so much. It's been lovely to have you here. And one last offering is to watch the sunset over a Golden Gate Bridge together. Till next time, thank you so much. It's been lovely.